It was supposed to be a quick grocery stop. But when his little girl tugged his sleeve and whispered, everything in Daniel's world stopped. That one innocent question cracked open a truth he'd been too busy surviving to see, and set into motion a chain of choices that would change an entire community forever. "Daddy, why is that lady sleeping outside?" Before we dive in, take a second to tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit subscribe because tomorrow's story, it's one of those that will blow your mind and heal your heart at the same time. The cold had a way of biting through fabric that night, a thin, needling chill that slipped beneath Daniel's jacket and settled into his bones. He pulled Emma's small, mittened hand closer, tucking it into his own, their grocery bag swinging between them like a fragile pendulum. The city was winding down, the last buses hissing to their stops, shop lights dimming, one by one. But the corner cafe still glowed faintly, the scent of burnt espresso lingering in the air. Emma hummed softly, her voice muffled by her scarf, the way children do when they feel safe beside someone who's carrying the weight of the world and pretending it isn't heavy. Then she stopped. "Daddy," she said. He turned, his breath visible in the air. Her gaze wasn't on him, but on the shadow curled up near the cafe steps. A woman, her frame small, wrapped in a blanket so thin it looked like paper. The street light above her flickered weakly, bathing her in alternating flashes of gold and gray. Beside her lay a worn plastic bag filled with what might have been everything she owned. Her face, though smudged with city dust, held a strange stillness, like someone who had long stopped expecting to be seen. "Daddy, why is that lady sleeping outside?" The words landed softly but hit like a hammer. Daniel blinked, his throat tightening. He could have said something easy, something like, "She's waiting for someone," or "She's just resting." But Emma's eyes were too honest, too unguarded. She wasn't looking for comfort, she was looking for truth. And Daniel realized, standing there under that flickering light, that he didn't have one. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Come on, sweetheart," he said finally, his voice gentler than usual. "It's late." Emma didn't move. She looked back again, her brows furrowed in quiet confusion. "But she's cold." "I know," Daniel said, almost to himself. They walked home in silence. The sound of their boots against cracked pavement filled the spaces where words should have been. Emma clutched the grocery bag tighter, as if holding on to something she could control. Daniel kept his head down, ashamed of how easy it had been to walk past pain for so many years. Maybe that's what surviving does. It teaches you to look away. Their apartment was small but warm, the kind of place where the walls carried the faint scent of old coffee and hope, stretched thin. Emma kicked off her shoes, crawled into her bed, and hugged her stuffed bunny close. "Daddy," she murmured sleepily, "doesn't she have a home?" He sat at the edge of her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Maybe she will someday," he said softly. "Can we help her?" He hesitated. "We don't even know her name." "Then we can ask," Emma whispered, eyes half closed, the logic of children as simple and flawless as prayer. Daniel turned off the lamp. The room dimmed to the quiet rhythm of her breathing. But even after she drifted into dreams, her question lingered in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. He lay on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling's faint cracks, the city's distant sirens echoing through the window. His mind replayed the image of the woman on the ground, the way her hands had been folded under her cheek, like a child pretending to sleep. He thought of his wife, gone 3 years now, and how quickly life can turn from laughter over burnt pancakes to counting coins in a grocery line. He remembered the nights after her funeral, sitting awake in the dark, feeling invisible, irrelevant, one mistake away from vanishing, like the woman on the sidewalk. When did the world stop seeing people, he wondered? When did kindness start needing an organization's logo to count? He sat up, rubbed his face, and looked toward Emma's bedroom door. Her question hadn't just pierced him, it had stripped away every excuse he'd built to protect himself from caring too much. The next morning the city looked the same, but Daniel didn't. He walked Emma to school, kissed her goodbye, and on his way to work he slowed near the cafe. The woman was still there, her blanket pulled higher, her breath visible in the cold. Daniel reached into his coat pocket, found a few crumpled bills, and hesitated. He didn't want to insult her with charity, he just wanted to acknowledge her existence. He bought 2 coffees instead of 1, set one gently on the ground beside her. She didn't stir. He whispered, "Stay warm," though he doubted she could hear him. As he walked away, the steam from the cup curled upward like a silent thank you. That night, when Emma asked again, "Daddy, did the lady find her bed yet?" He didn't have an answer, but this time he promised himself he would. Morning came too early for men like Daniel Rhodes. The alarm didn't just wake him, it reminded him. Rent was due in a week, overtime wasn't guaranteed, and the ache in his chest that never quite went away had started to feel like an old friend. The smell of burnt toast drifted from the kitchen, where Emma sat on her stool, swinging her legs and humming through a mouthful of cereal. She'd drawn another picture on a napkin, stick figures under a sky full of stars, one of them wrapped in a blanket, the lady from the cafe. He stared at it for a moment too long. He used to start mornings with music, back when the apartment was louder, filled with laughter, and the sound of a woman's voice reminding him to slow down, to breathe. Now the silence pressed against the walls like a heavy fog. He pulled on his gray uniform shirt, the one with the faded company logo stitched above his name, and checked the clock. 6:47 a.m., late again. He tightened his boots, grabbed his thermos, and kissed the top of Emma's head. "Don't forget your mittens," he said, because that's what fathers who don't know what else to say tell their daughters. The warehouse was a kingdom of noise, machines humming, forklifts beeping, men shouting numbers that meant nothing to anyone outside those walls. But inside Daniel's mind there was only that woman's face, the way her hair had fallen across her cheek like a curtain between her and the world. He'd seen her before, plenty of times. Everyone had. The one by the bakery dumpster, bundled up with her cardboard signs and quiet dignity. She'd become part of the scenery, like the cracked sidewalk or the faded billboard above the street. He used to walk past her without a second glance. Now, after Emma's question, he couldn't. At lunch, he sat with Pete and Carlos near the vending machines. The usual talk, football, bills, the supervisor's latest mood swing. Pete bit into his sandwich and said, "You see that lady still hanging around the corner?" "I swear, man, it's not right. City ought to do something." Daniel looked up. "What kind of something?" Pete shrugged. "I don't know. Move her." "There's shelters." Carlos grunted agreement. Daniel stared down at his coffee, his reflection distorted by ripples. "Maybe," he said softly. "They already did something, and that's why she's there now." No one answered. The rest of the day blurred together in clanging metal and diesel fumes. He made mistakes, small ones, mislabeled a shipment, dropped a box too hard. The supervisor glared, but Daniel barely noticed. His body was there, his mind wasn't. When the shift ended, he didn't go straight home. He found himself parked near the cafe, engine idling, watching the spot where she usually sat. But the sidewalk was empty tonight. Just a crumpled cup, a scrap of paper, and the faint smell of baked bread. Back home, the apartment felt smaller than usual. Emma was coloring on the floor, the TV flickering quietly in the background. "Hi, Daddy," she said without looking up. "I made her a bed." He frowned. "What?" She turned the drawing toward him. The woman again, this time lying under a purple blanket made of marker lines. "You said maybe she'll find one, so I drew her one." Something in his chest twisted. He sank onto the couch, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work. "That's beautiful, kiddo," he managed. "She'd like that." Emma smiled, pleased, and went back to coloring. But after a minute she asked, "Did she find a real one yet?" Daniel didn't answer right away. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. He wanted to tell her yes, that the lady had found warmth, food, safety. that the world was kinder than it looked, but lying to her felt like stealing something from both of them. "Not yet," he said finally, "but maybe soon." That night, after Emma fell asleep, Daniel stood at the window and watched the city lights blink like tired eyes. He thought about how people could vanish in plain sight, how life could turn a man invisible without warning. He thought of his wife, gone too soon, and how quickly love can become memory, and memory can become noise you learn to live with. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered, shoulders slumped, hands rough, eyes dimmed by too many unfinished promises. He realized he was running on fumes, doing everything except living. And still, through the hum of the city, he heard her voice again, small and curious. "Daddy, why is that lady sleeping outside?" For the first time, he didn't just hear it. He felt it, and he knew, with quiet certainty, that pretending he couldn't do anything was no longer an option. The wind that night carried a sharp edge, slicing through layers of fabric and skin alike. Daniel pulled his jacket tighter and adjusted the lid on the second coffee cup so it wouldn't spill. Steam rose from both cups in ghostly spirals, fading into the night air. He told himself it was just coffee, nothing more, nothing noble. He wasn't out to save anyone. He just couldn't shake the image of her, the woman from the cafe steps, folded in on herself like the city had forgotten she was human. Maybe it wasn't even about her. Maybe it was about the look in Emma's eyes when she'd asked that question. Why is that lady sleeping outside? That question hadn't let him rest. The cafe was closing when he arrived. The windows glowed faintly, casting rectangles of light across the sidewalk. The scent of roasted beans and rain-wet pavement mixed in the air. And there she was, the same figure hunched beneath a threadbare blanket, one shoe off, her hands tucked under her chin, like she was afraid they'd vanish if she let go. Her face was half hidden beneath tangled hair. For a long moment Daniel just stood there, the two cups warming his palms, trying to think of what to say that wouldn't sound like pity. He took a step forward. The gravel beneath his boots crunched. Her head jerked up, eyes wide and wild, scanning for threat. "It's cold tonight," he said quietly. He extended the coffee like a peace offering. "I thought maybe you could use this." Her gaze darted from his face to the cup and back again. Suspicion lingered in every line of her body. "You a cop?" she asked, voice rough, brittle from disuse. He shook his head. "No, just a dad." Something in that answer softened her, barely. Her eyes, a pale gray-green, the color of sea glass left too long in the tide, studied him for a beat longer before she reached out, slow and cautious, like she was afraid the kindness would disappear if she moved too quickly. She took the cup, cradled it between both hands, and blew on the rim. The first sip came with a small sound, half sigh, half relief. No thank you, no smile, no conversation. But in that silence something shifted, an invisible thread connecting two people who had both forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Daniel stood there awkwardly for a moment, unsure whether to say more or leave. The city hummed around them, cars passing, neon buzzing, a man across the street shouting into the dark, but none of it felt as loud as the quiet between them. He cleared his throat. "If you need another tomorrow, I come by around this time," he said. She didn't look up, but he thought he saw the smallest nod, or maybe it was just the wind stirring her hair. He turned to go, the weight of the untouched coffee in his hand suddenly lighter. He didn't look back until he reached his car. She was sipping slowly, both hands still wrapped around the cup, like it was a tiny flame keeping the night at bay. For reasons he couldn't explain, that image stayed with him, followed him all the way home. In the apartment, Emma was already asleep, her small body curled beneath the blanket, the soft hum of the radiator filling the room. Daniel set the spare cup of coffee on the counter and leaned against the wall, eyes closed. For the first time in a long while, the ache inside his chest didn't feel so hollow. He'd spent years numbing himself, to loss, to the world, to his own grief. But that simple act, handing a stranger a cup of warmth, had cracked something open. He thought of his wife then, how she used to say that kindness didn't need an audience to count. "Do the small things," she'd whispered once, when he was too tired to believe in anything bigger. That's how the world starts to heal. As the apartment settled into its midnight stillness, Daniel finally lay down. The noise of the city faded into a lullaby of distant tires and humming streetlights. He wasn't proud. He wasn't heroic. But he had done something, even if it was just a cup of coffee and a few words exchanged in the cold. And as he drifted toward sleep, he realized something he hadn't felt since before the funeral. That faint flicker of purpose that sits right between sadness and hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel Rhodes felt like he'd done something that mattered. The paper was wrinkled and smudged with crayon fingerprints, the kind of school assignment parents usually stick on the fridge without thinking. But Daniel didn't move. He just stood there staring at the crooked letters scrawled across the top. What I want to change about the world. The other kids had drawn smiling suns, whales swimming through clean oceans, rockets shooting toward cartoon planets. Emma had drawn a blanket, a tiny figure under it, tucked against a sidewalk beneath a yellow lamplight. Next to it, in her uneven handwriting, were 7 words that made Daniel's throat tighten. I want to make sure no one sleeps outside. He sat at the kitchen table long after Emma had gone to bed. The paper spread in front of him like a mirror reflecting something he hadn't been ready to face. Her words weren't naive. They were simple, painfully so. But in their simplicity, they carried weight. The kind that pressed against your chest and whispered that surviving isn't the same as living. He thought of Mara, the woman with the sea-glass eyes and the quiet hands, of how she had clutched the coffee cup like it was the first warmth she'd been offered in weeks. He thought of Emma's question that night, "Why is that lady sleeping outside?" And realized this was her answer. She hadn't forgotten. Children rarely do. The next morning, dawn came slow and gray. Daniel made breakfast half awake, the cheap coffee bitter, the toast too dark. Emma sat at the counter, humming, as she colored another drawing, this one of a house with a huge red heart on the roof. "What's that?" he asked. Butterknife paused midair. "Our house," she said matter-of-factly, "but bigger. So there's room for people who don't have one." He didn't know what to say. He just nodded and smiled, though his chest felt like it was full of wet cement. After dropping her off at school, he sat in the driver's seat for a long time, engine running, hands still on the wheel. Then, almost without deciding to, he turned the car toward downtown, toward the cafe. The streets were quiet, the kind of morning hush that belonged to delivery drivers and people who'd been awake all night. When he parked, the space beside the bakery dumpster looked the same. Gray pavement, a rusted trash bin, a few discarded cups rolling lazily in the wind. But Mara wasn't there. Her blanket, her bag, the little spot she had claimed as her own, it was all gone. Daniel felt something strange then, something that surprised him. Disappointment. Not relief, not even concern, but a hollow ache, like the city had lost one of its last pieces of truth. He took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the ground. That's when he saw it, a small piece of cardboard, folded once, resting near the cafe steps. He knelt down and turned it over. In faded ink, written in uneven, trembling letters, were the words, "Be kind." "I'm trying." He read it once, then again. The third time his vision blurred. He stood there for a long time, holding the note in his calloused hands. Cars passed. A bus hissed at the curb. Life continued like it always did, blind and busy. But Daniel stayed rooted to the spot, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. "Be kind, I'm trying." There was no plea in those words, no bitterness, no anger, just quiet truth, the kind that doesn't demand to be heard, it just waits for someone to listen. For the first time in years, something inside Daniel shifted, like a locked door creaking open after being forgotten too long. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do or if doing anything would matter. But he knew one thing for certain: surviving wasn't enough anymore. Emma had seen something in the world that needed fixing, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for him to start fixing himself too. When he picked Emma up from the neighbors that evening, she ran into his arms, her backpack bouncing. "Did she find a bed yet, Daddy?" He crouched down to meet her eyes. They were full of hope, the kind that still believed one person could make a difference. "Not yet," he said softly, "but we're going to help her, okay?" Emma smiled as if that settled everything. "Good," she said, "because I already drew her a pillow." That night, after Emma had drifted off to sleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table again, the cardboard note beside her crayon drawing. The words echoed through the silence. "Be kind. I'm trying." He didn't know what came next. He only knew that tomorrow he wouldn't just walk past the cafe, not anymore. The morning light was weak and gray when Daniel parked outside the cafe again, a thermos of coffee cooling in the cup holder and a paper bag resting on the seat beside him. He'd told himself he was just checking, just curious. But truth had a way of slipping through excuses, and he knew the real reason. He couldn't stop thinking about Mara, the woman with the sea-glass eyes, the one who had disappeared but somehow stayed in his mind like a song that refused to fade. Inside, the cafe was half awake, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and early chatter. The barista, a young woman with a septum ring and kind eyes, looked up when Daniel approached the counter. "Hey," he began awkwardly, fingers fidgeting with the zipper on his jacket. "That woman who used to sit out front sometimes, thin, short hair, kind of quiet. Have you seen her?" The barista's expression softened with recognition. "Mara?" she said, like the name was a secret passed only between those who noticed. "She comes by early, real early, gets a cup of hot water if we've got extras. Sometimes a muffin, if someone forgets to pick up their order." "Mara," Daniel repeated, letting the name settle in his mouth. It suited her, simple, steady, like something that had endured storms. He nodded, thanked the barista, and walked out before his voice could betray the weight in his chest. He sat in his car for a while, the city waking around him. Delivery trucks rumbled past, and somewhere a street musician tuned his guitar. The world moved, indifferent as ever. But Daniel's mind was fixed on one thought. She comes by in the mornings. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out a napkin. With the pen he used for work logs, he scribbled a few words, crossed them out, then started again. No strings, just food. He folded the note and slipped it into the paper bag, tucking in 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a small chocolate bar Emma had insisted he take to work the day before. He smiled faintly at the thought. "Looks like it's finding a better use, kiddo," he murmured. He placed the bag on the bench near the cafe entrance and stepped back. For a moment he hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one saw him. It felt strange, leaving something meant to be found but not acknowledged. Then again, maybe that was the point. The next morning the bag was gone. He didn't know what he expected, maybe for it to be untouched, maybe to see her sitting there again. But instead, there was only a folded scrap of paper weighed down by a pebble. He unfolded it slowly, his heart thudding, as though he had just stumbled into something sacred. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. The ink smudged like it had been written in haste, or tears. "You saw me, that's enough." He read it once, then again, until the words blurred. There was no signature, no flourish, just truth. Raw, quiet, and heavier than anything he'd carried in years. That night, Emma sat cross-legged on the living room floor coloring while Daniel reheated leftover pasta. "Daddy," she asked without looking up, "did you see the lady today?" He paused, the wooden spoon hovering over the pot. "Yeah," he said softly. "She's okay for now." Emma smiled, satisfied with that answer. But Daniel knew better. Okay wasn't enough. Okay was a word people used when they'd stopped expecting more, when they'd learned to live just above the line of breaking. He couldn't shake the thought that Mara had thanked him not for the food, but for something else, for remembering she existed. After Emma went to bed, He found himself sitting at the kitchen table again, the note resting beside her crayon drawings. The city hummed beyond the window, 1,000 lives stacked in quiet boxes, each carrying their own version of okay. Daniel stared at the words until the letters seemed to breathe. You saw me. He thought of how few people in this world really were seen. How often he'd walked through crowds, eyes down, missing the stories written on the faces around him. He wasn't special, not in the way heroes were, but maybe that was the point. Maybe being ordinary was exactly what the world needed more of, ordinary people who stopped pretending not to notice. When he finally turned off the lights, he glanced once more at the folded note on the table. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he'd leave another bag, not out of guilt, not even out of duty, but because someone had finally looked back, and that somehow made all the difference. The lunchroom was a windowless box that smelled of burnt coffee and overworked microwaves. A dozen men in steel-toed boots sat scattered across folding tables, chewing in rhythm with the hum of fluorescent lights. Daniel sat at the far end, his sandwich untouched, staring at a faded safety poster peeling from the wall. The words, "Stay alert, stay alive," felt ironic. Lately, staying awake had been the hardest part. Pete, loud as ever, was in the middle of a story about the zombie parade downtown. That's what he called the people on the streets, the ones pushing carts, the ones sleeping under bridges, the ones who'd stopped being names and had turned into shadows. Saw one this morning by the old bakery, Pete said through a mouthful of chips. Had a sign that said, "Smile, it's free." I mean, come on. Maybe if they smiled less and worked more, they wouldn't be begging for change. A few chuckles rippled through the room, the kind of laughter that's more habit than humor. Daniel didn't laugh. He sat perfectly still, the words hitting harder than they should have. Normally, he would have stayed quiet, let the conversation drift by like static, but something in him broke through the silence. He set his thermos down and said calmly, "You ever wonder what would happen if one of us lost everything?" The noise in the room thinned, like someone had turned down the volume. Pete blinked, still smirking. "What's that supposed to mean?" Daniel shrugged, his voice even but edged. "I mean, what if the company folded tomorrow? What if the rent doubled? What if your kid got sick and you had to choose between medicine and mortgage? How far do you think you'd make it before you were one of those people?" Pete frowned, caught off guard. "Wouldn't happen. I've got savings, family, a plan." Daniel let out a quiet, humorless laugh. That's what everyone thinks, right until it doesn't. The words hung there, heavier than the smell of coffee. Carlos, sitting beside Pete, shifted uncomfortably. Someone opened a bag of chips just to break the silence, but the noise couldn't drown out the truth. Daniel saw it in their faces, a flicker of fear, the kind that hides behind denial. He stood and carried his tray to the trash, feeling a dozen eyes follow him. As he dumped what was left of his sandwich, he caught his reflection in the vending machine's glass. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, the company logo stitched above his heart. He looked like everyone else in that room, yet somehow he saw himself differently now. A man one missed paycheck away from vanishing, one wrong twist of fate from sitting where Mara had. He pressed his palm against the cool metal, staring into his own blurred reflection. That's what we all think, until it does. The rest of the day crawled by in slow, mechanical rhythm. The clang of forklifts, the grind of gears, the endless beeping of scanners, it all sounded distant, hollow. Daniel's body moved, but his mind was elsewhere, looping through images he couldn't shake. Mara's trembling hands wrapped around a coffee cup, Emma's school project with the blanket and the stars, and the small folded note that said, "You saw me." That's enough. When the final whistle blew, he didn't join the others heading to their cars. Instead, he walked to the far corner of the loading dock and leaned against the railing. The air smelled like rain and metal. The city skyline loomed in the distance, sharp and indifferent. He thought about how many people were out there right now, invisible in plain sight. He thought about his wife and how easily the floor had dropped out from under him after she was gone. He'd survived because he had Emma, because he'd had something, someone, to anchor him. But what happens when you lose that last thread, when the world stops catching you? That night, after tucking Emma into bed, Daniel sat at the window with a cup of tea gone cold. Outside, the streetlight flickered, just like the one near the cafe. He could almost see Mara there, her silhouette forming in the glow, her quiet strength wrapped in a threadbare blanket. He remembered how she'd looked at him, not with gratitude, but with recognition, like she'd seen something of herself in him. He rubbed his palms together slowly, the way he did when the warehouse chill got into his bones. Only this time, it wasn't the cold that unsettled him. It was the realization that the line between his life and hers wasn't as thick as he'd always believed. It was thinner than breath, fragile as the space between kindness and indifference. As the night deepened, he whispered to the dark, almost a confession, "We're all closer than we think." Then, softly, almost as if answering himself, "And maybe that's why it matters to care." It was Sunday morning, the kind that carried the smell of pancakes and the hum of an old radio trying to tune itself into something worth hearing. Daniel stood by the stove, flipping batter that came out too thick, watching it hiss against the pan. Emma sat at the small table by the window, her crayons scattered like tiny bursts of color across the surface. She had that look again, the quiet, serious one she got when she was lost in a world she was drawing. Every now and then she'd glance up, study him like an artist studies light, then return to her work. When he finally set the plate in front of her, she didn't eat right away. She pushed it aside, still coloring, tongue peeking between her teeth in concentration. "Almost done," she murmured. Daniel smiled faintly and poured himself another cup of coffee, the bitterness grounding him against the soft ache that mornings always carried. "Can I show you something?" she asked suddenly, holding up the paper. He walked over, wiping his hands on a towel, and looked down. The picture was simple, drawn with the honesty only a child's heart could translate. 3 people stood beneath a dark blue sky dotted with yellow stars, stick figures, but different. One was small with a pink dress and blonde hair, Emma, obviously. Another taller one with brown scribbled hair and a mop in his hand, him. And between them, wrapped in a gray blanket, lay a woman with messy hair and closed eyes. The stars above her seemed brighter, almost protective. "That's her," Emma said proudly, tapping the figure in the middle. "The lady from outside. She's part of our family now." Daniel felt something catch in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't find words. He swallowed, nodded, and managed a soft smile. "She looks peaceful," he said, voice unsteady. "She is," Emma replied, "because we saw her." He stared at the drawing longer than he meant to, the lines blurring slightly as his eyes stung. Emma had done with crayons and paper what so many adults failed to do with all their logic and caution. She had made room, no labels, no distance, just belonging. He crouched down beside her. "You've got a big heart, you know that?" She shrugged. "You say people need to be seen. So I drew her so she wouldn't disappear." Daniel nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He thought about the nights Mara had slept beneath that streetlight, unseen by 1,000 passing eyes, about how he'd once been one of those eyes. And now, his daughter, 7 years old and full of quiet grace, had rewritten that woman's story with the simple stroke of a crayon. She had drawn her into safety, into home. After breakfast, Emma insisted on taping the drawing to the fridge. She stood on her tiptoes, pressing it against the cool metal with both hands until it stuck. "Now she won't get lost again," she said with satisfaction. Daniel watched her, heart heavy with pride and something deeper, something that felt like both love and reckoning. He realized how easily compassion came to children, how naturally they reached for connection before the world taught them to pull away. Maybe, he thought, kindness wasn't something you learned. Maybe it was something you unlearned as you got older. Later that day, while Emma napped on the couch, Daniel sat at the table with his phone. He opened the camera app, looked at the drawing on the fridge, and took a photo. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true. He stared at the image on the screen, feeling that same ache behind his ribs, the one that came when you remembered the person you used to be and realized you didn't want to be him anymore. He sent the photo to his own email, typing a subject line without thinking, "For when I forget what matters." That night, after he tucked Emma into bed, Daniel lingered in the doorway, watching her sleep with the soft rise and fall of innocence that still believed the world could be fixed with crayons and good intentions. Then he turned off the light, sat by the window, and looked out toward the direction of the cafe. The stars were faint tonight, hidden behind clouds, but he imagined one shining a little brighter above a woman named Mara, a woman who, somewhere out there, might still be trying. He thought about Emma's drawing again and smiled to himself. Maybe family wasn't about who shared your last name or your address. Maybe it was about who you refused to let vanish. The rain had been steady all night, the kind that turned streets into mirrors and the city into a blur of gray reflections. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the low hum of the refrigerator keeping him company. Emma had gone to bed hours ago, her soft breathing drifting through the cracked door of her room. He was staring at the small pile of notes and drawings she'd made. The one of Mara taped proudly to the fridge, another of their apartment surrounded by stars. He didn't know why, but he couldn't make himself go to bed. Something about the night felt restless, unfinished. A sudden tapping broke through the quiet. 3 soft knocks against the window. Daniel froze. His first thought was wind or branches, but then it came again, deliberate, urgent. He rose slowly, heart thudding, and pulled the curtain aside. There, framed by the watery glow of the streetlight, stood Mara. Her hair was plastered to her face, soaked through by the rain. The same worn jacket clung to her like a second skin, her fingers red from the cold. In her hand, she clutched something, a small crumpled piece of cardboard. Even through the glass, Daniel could see it. The note, the one he'd left with the food bag. He opened the window halfway, the smell of rain and asphalt rushing in. "Mara?" he said, barely believing she was real and not some ghost conjured by guilt and memory. She blinked, her lips trembling slightly. "You meant it?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse, raw from disuse. "About no strings?" He didn't hesitate. "I meant it." For a moment neither of them moved. The rain kept falling, tapping against the sill like impatient fingers. Then Daniel stepped back and opened the door. She hesitated on the threshold. It was more than a doorway. It was a line, invisible but heavy, between the world that had turned its back on her and one that still offered shelter. She stood there, shivering, water dripping from her sleeves onto the floor. "I won't stay long," she murmured. "Don't worry about that right now," Daniel said softly. "Just come in." She crossed the line. The warmth of the apartment hit her immediately. Steam rose faintly from her jacket as the heat embraced her. She stood there awkwardly in the small living room, eyes darting from the couch to the bookshelf to the drawings on the fridge. The space was humble, mismatched furniture, flickering lamp, old carpet, but to her it might as well have been a cathedral. "I didn't want to bother you," she said after a moment, voice cracking around the edges, "but it's bad out there tonight." They closed the shelter early. Daniel nodded. "You're not bothering anyone." He went to the kitchen, grabbed a towel, and handed it to her. She accepted it slowly, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed. He poured 2 mugs of tea. She held hers with both hands, watching the steam rise. Her shoulders loosened bit by bit, though her eyes never stopped scanning the room, the way people do when they've learned not to trust the walls around them. "You've got a little girl," she said quietly, nodding toward the fridge. "Emma," he said, smiling faintly. "She's asleep." Mara's gaze lingered on the drawing of herself under the stars. "She drew me?" "Yeah," Daniel said, his throat tightening. "She said you're part of our family now." Mara let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She pressed the towel to her face, shaking her head. "You don't even know me." "Maybe not," he said, sitting across from her, "but I know what being forgotten feels like." She didn't answer right away, just stared into her tea, the rain still whispering against the window. Finally, she said, "It's been a long time since anyone opened a door." Daniel's voice softened. "Then maybe it's time someone did." The clock ticked quietly in the background, steady and alive. Mara finished her tea, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't have to." When he stood to grab a blanket from the hall closet, she stopped him with a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He turned, holding the blanket in his arms. "Because my daughter asked a question I couldn't answer," he said, "and I don't want to fail her again." He set the blanket on the couch, gesturing for her to sit. She did, hesitantly, curling beneath it, like someone learning the language of comfort for the first time. Daniel dimmed the light and glanced once more toward Emma's door before sitting at the kitchen table again. Through the quiet, he could still hear Mara's uneven breathing, the faint rustle of fabric as she settled in. Outside, the rain softened to a hush. Inside, for the first time in years, Daniel's apartment felt full. Not crowded, just full. When he finally turned off the lamp, he caught a glimpse of Mara's face in the dim light. Her eyes were closed, her features soft, the exhaustion melting away into something like peace. And Daniel thought, not for the first time, that sometimes the smallest doors open into the biggest miracles. The kettle hissed softly, a steady whisper that filled the quiet apartment. Daniel stood by the counter watching steam curl upward like a slow exhale. The air still smelled faintly of rain and the faint citrus of dish soap. Mara sat at the small kitchen table, wrapped in one of Emma's spare blankets. Her wet jacket hung from a chair, dripping quietly onto the floor. The lamp above them cast a warm, amber glow that softened the edges of everything, the chipped mugs, the tired linoleum, even the lines etched deep in Mara's face. "Sugar?" he asked. She shook her head. "Haven't had it in years." "Don't need it." Her voice was rough, worn down by cold nights and too many swallowed words. He poured the tea, sliding one mug toward her. She cupped it carefully, like it might disappear if she held it too tight. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the storm had slowed to a drizzle, each drop against the window a small, fragile heartbeat. Mara broke the silence first. "It's strange being inside again." Daniel looked up from his own cup. "Strange good or strange bad?" She shrugged. "A little of both. You forget how loud quiet can be." He didn't push her to say more, but she went on anyway, her words tentative at first, like testing the temperature of the air. "I wasn't always like this," she said. "I had a job, a place. My mom got sick, cancer, and I was the only one left to take care of her. I thought I could do both, work days, nurse her nights. Turns out you can't save a person and yourself at the same time." She paused to sip her tea, her hands trembling slightly. "When she passed, I stopped showing up to work. Didn't even realize the days were blurring together. They replaced me within a week." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just nodded, eyes steady, giving her the space she'd been denied for too long. "I tried getting back on my feet," she continued. "Tried finding something else, but once you fall, people stop seeing you the same. One late rent notice, one missed paycheck, and suddenly you're the problem. I stayed with a friend for a while, but she had kids and bills of her own. I didn't blame her. You can't keep helping someone who stopped helping themselves. And then—" She gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the city that pulsed just beyond. "Then it's the streets." Her voice cracked slightly on that word. Streets. It wasn't just a place, it was a sentence. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "People think we choose this," she said quietly. "Like it's a lifestyle, a rebellion, a lack of effort. But sometimes the world just stops choosing you." Daniel's throat tightened. He'd never thought of it like that. Not really. Not until now. He'd always assumed homelessness was a slide that started with bad choices, not bad luck. But sitting across from her, seeing how her fingers trembled as she spoke, how she avoided eye contact not from shame, but from muscle memory, he understood. It wasn't about failure, it was about being forgotten. He took a slow breath. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked up, startled, almost defensive. For what? For how easy it is to walk past someone and not see the whole story, he said softly. For thinking I was different. Her expression softened then, her shoulders easing for the first time. "You're here," she said simply. "That's different enough." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. The tea cooled between them, untouched now, but neither cared. Daniel studied her face, the faint scars near her temple, the exhaustion around her eyes, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure if it was pity, respect, or recognition. Maybe all three. At one point, Mara smiled faintly, a fragile thing that still managed to light her face. "Your daughter," she said, nodding toward the drawings on the fridge. "She's got a good heart." "She gets that from her mom," Daniel murmured. "You lost her?" He nodded. "A few years back." They didn't need to say more. Grief had its own language, and they were both fluent. When she finally stood to leave the table, Daniel reached out instinctively, touching her sleeve. "You can stay tonight," he said. "It's no trouble." Mara hesitated, then nodded once, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "Thank you," she whispered. After she disappeared into the living room, Daniel sat alone at the table, the mug still warm under his palm. Something in him felt heavier, but not in the way that crushed, in the way that rooted. He realized he hadn't just listened to her story. He'd become a part of it, and maybe, for the first time in years, that felt like exactly where he was meant to be. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the whispers had started. News travels fast in buildings where the walls are thin and people don't have enough excitement in their own lives. Daniel noticed it first when he took out the trash. Mrs. Callahan from 2B, who usually greeted him with a tired smile and a complaint about the leaky radiator, barely nodded this time. Her eyes flicked toward his door, then back to him, her lips tightening around unspoken words. He knew that look, the kind that dressed curiosity as concern. When he came back upstairs, the hallway felt quieter than usual. The air carried a kind of tension, like it was listening. Mara was sitting at the small kitchen table, wearing one of his old sweaters that hung loose around her shoulders. She was eating toast, slow and polite, as though afraid to take up too much space. "You sure this is okay?" she asked, glancing toward the door. Daniel smiled faintly. "It's just toast," he said. But he knew what she meant. It didn't take long. By the end of the day, someone had already called the landlord. He showed up that evening, knocking hard enough to rattle the picture frames. "Dan," he said when the door opened, his voice too casual to be genuine. "Can we talk?" Daniel stepped aside reluctantly. The landlord was a short, heavy man who always smelled faintly of paint thinner and authority. He looked around the apartment with the brisk disapproval of someone inspecting property rather than visiting a home. His eyes landed on Mara, who stood near the sink, frozen like a deer in headlights. "I got a few calls," the landlord began. "Tenants saying you've got someone staying here who's not on the lease." He looked at Mara again, and Daniel saw the pause in his words, the tiny hesitation where judgment slipped through. "You can't just bring people like that in here, Dan. You understand, right? Liability, safety, the rules." "People like what?" Daniel interrupted. His tone was calm, but it carried something beneath it, something that made the landlord stop. The man cleared his throat. "Come on, you know what I mean. Look, I get it, you're trying to help, but we can't have—" "She's not people like that," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "She's human." The silence that followed was heavy. The landlord shifted uncomfortably. "Rules are rules," he muttered. But he didn't meet Daniel's eyes. "I'm just saying, make sure this doesn't become a permanent situation. He lingered in the doorway as if waiting for Daniel to apologize. When it became clear he wouldn't, the landlord sighed and left, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Mara stood very still for a long time after the door closed. Her hands trembled slightly, and Daniel noticed she'd folded the hem of the sweater into her fists. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You didn't," he said. "They just don't understand yet." She shook her head. "They never do." He wanted to tell her it wasn't true, that people could change, that kindness could ripple outward, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. The truth was, the world was often quicker to build fences than bridges. Still, as he looked at her standing in his kitchen, small, worn, and yet impossibly strong, he knew he couldn't let that world dictate what was right inside these four walls. That night, Emma came home from her neighbor's, waving a sheet of paper covered in glitter glue and stars. "We made wishes at school," she said. "Mine was for the lady to have a warm place forever." She turned to Mara with that effortless sincerity only a child could carry. "You can have mine if you want." Mara blinked hard, her lips parting, but no words coming out. Daniel watched as she crouched down to Emma's level. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever given me." Later, after Emma was asleep, Daniel stood by the window, looking out over the dim courtyard. A few blinds across the way tilted open, the shape of silhouettes lingering longer than they needed to. He knew they were watching. He didn't care. For once, he wasn't afraid of being judged, of being misunderstood. Maybe for the first time since his wife died, he felt sure of something, that compassion was worth more than approval. He turned back toward the room. Mara was still awake, sitting at the table, tracing the edge of Emma's wish with her finger. The words glittered faintly in the light. "A warm place forever." Daniel sat across from her, the quiet between them easy now, almost sacred. "You're safe here," he said finally. Mara met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd stepped into his life, she looked like she believed him. The knock came early, firm and deliberate, the kind that carried purpose, not curiosity. Daniel was midway through packing Emma's lunch when he froze, the butter knife hovering above a slice of bread. Mara was at the table cradling her tea, her shoulders already tense. The sound came again, sharper this time. 3 knocks evenly spaced. Official. Daniel wiped his hands on a towel and opened the door. Standing in the hallway was a woman in a gray coat holding a clipboard. Her expression was neutral, professional, but not unkind. The kind of person who'd seen everything twice and learned not to flinch. "Mr. Rhodes?" she asked. He nodded cautiously. "That's me." "I'm Claire Donovan," she said, offering a quick flash of ID. "I'm with the city's outreach division. I received a call about a woman staying here. Mara Densley?" Mara's name sounded strange in the sterile air of the hallway, like it didn't belong to her anymore. Daniel hesitated, unsure if admitting anything would help or hurt. "She's here," he said finally, voice steady. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," Claire said, her tone softening. "Just a visit." "May I come in?" Daniel stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Mara had already stood, one hand gripping the back of the chair as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. She looked small and defensive, her eyes wary but alert. "It's okay," Daniel said gently. "She just wants to talk." Claire nodded toward Mara. "I've been trying to locate you for weeks," she said. "We had you listed at the shelter, but they said you left." "I didn't leave," Mara murmured. "They closed early that night." Claire's expression softened. "I know. It happens more often than it should." She took a seat at the table, setting her clipboard down but not opening it yet. "You've got someone looking out for you, it seems." Mara gave a faint, uncertain smile and glanced toward Daniel. "He didn't have to," she said quietly. "I wanted to," he replied. Claire folded her hands. "I'm not here to take you anywhere you don't want to go," she said. "But if you're ready, I can help you get into transitional housing. It's not a shelter. It's a program. Private room, counseling, job placement, the works. You'd have a fresh start." The words hung in the air like sunlight breaking through cloud. Mara blinked slowly, as if afraid to hope. "I've heard that before," she said. "Usually ends with a waiting list or a form that gets lost." Claire smiled faintly. "I've been doing this job long enough to know promises don't mean much without follow-through. But I've already got a slot open. You'd just need one reference, someone who's seen you trying." Daniel didn't even hesitate. "You've got one." Both women looked at him. Claire raised an eyebrow. "You'd be willing to vouch for her?" "I'm already doing that," he said. "Every day she's been here, she's been trying." She just needed a door that didn't close on her. Something in Claire's face shifted. Approval, maybe even admiration. She scribbled a note on her clipboard. "That's good enough for me." Mara's hands were shaking now, not from fear but from something closer to disbelief. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Daniel said. "Just let her help you." Claire slid a few papers across the table. "We'll need your signature and a few details. Nothing complicated. You could move in as soon as next week." Mara hesitated, staring at the pen like it was a test she wasn't sure she could pass. "What if I mess it up?" she asked. Claire smiled softly. "Then you start again. That's what this is for." The rain started up again outside, gentle against the window. Mara finally took the pen. Her signature was small, careful, like she was relearning how to claim her name. When Claire stood to leave, she extended her hand to Daniel. "You'd be surprised," she said, "how rare it is to meet someone who doesn't look away." Daniel didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded. "Thanks for coming." As the door closed, Mara sat back down, staring at the signed papers in front of her. "I don't think anyone's ever said I could start again," she said softly. Daniel smiled, pouring her another cup of tea. "Then let this be the first time." She looked up at him, eyes wet but bright. "You really think I can do this?" "I don't think," he said. "I know." And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the smell of tea and rain, something shifted again. Not a rescue, not redemption, but a beginning. The morning began like any other, soft light bleeding through the thin curtains, the smell of coffee drifting through the air. Daniel moved through the apartment half asleep, careful not to wake Emma. He reached for the second mug, the one that had quietly become part of his routine again since Mara started staying with them. Her things, a folded blanket, a worn coat, the small mug she liked because of its chipped handle, sat neatly on the counter, always in the same place. Except today they didn't. The blanket was gone, the coat too. The mug sat in the sink, rinsed and turned upside down, still dripping faintly into the drain. For a moment Daniel thought maybe she'd gone for a walk, maybe she'd stepped out for air. But something about the stillness felt wrong, too complete. The air in the apartment was missing her shape, her quiet presence that had somehow woven itself into their days. He checked the door, locked from the outside. He checked the closet, empty. "Mara?" His voice sounded too loud in the small space. No answer. He opened Emma's door gently. She was still asleep, her hair sprawled over the pillow like golden threads. On her nightstand sat the crayon drawing, the one with 3 people under the stars. He stared at it for a long time, feeling something twist inside him. By the time Emma woke, he'd already searched every corner of the building, checked the stairwell, the courtyard, even the cafe. No sign of her. When Emma shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, she noticed the missing blanket immediately. "Where's the lady?" she asked, her voice still soft from sleep. Daniel knelt in front of her. "I think she had to go somewhere," he said gently. Emma's eyes filled fast, her small face crumpling. "Did we do something bad?" He pulled her close. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong," but when she cried into his shoulder, the words felt fragile, uncertain. Because deep down, he wondered if he had done something wrong, said too much, offered too little, made her feel trapped in the kindness she wasn't ready to accept. The day dragged. At work, he moved like a ghost, his hands mechanical, his mind miles away. Every time the warehouse door opened, he half expected her to walk in, dripping from rain again, holding that cardboard note. By the time his shift ended, the world outside had turned gold and gray. He drove past the cafe without thinking, headlights sweeping across the bench. It was empty, just like before. That night, Emma was quiet during dinner. She pushed her peas around her plate, her voice barely above a whisper, when she said, "Maybe she doesn't like us anymore." Daniel set his fork down. "That's not it," he said. "Sometimes people leave because they don't know how to stay." Emma looked up, confused. "But we were nice." He smiled sadly. "Yeah," he said, "we were." After she went to bed, Daniel sat at the table staring at the chipped mug in the sink. The sound of the clock ticked louder than usual, each second pressing into the hollow space she'd left behind. He wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed, but all he felt was a deep, quiet ache, the kind that comes when something unfinished slips away. Sleep didn't come easy. He kept hearing her voice from that night in the kitchen, soft and uncertain. Sometimes the world just stops choosing you. Maybe she'd stopped believing the world could choose her again. Maybe she'd left before she could prove herself wrong. The next morning, on his way to drop Emma off at school, he slowed as they passed the cafe. And there on the bench where she used to sit, something caught his eye, a scrap of cardboard, folded neatly, weighed down by a small stone. He parked the car, heart pounding, and picked it up. The handwriting was hers, small, deliberate, and trembling slightly, like each word carried its own weight. "Thank you for reminding me I'm still someone worth helping." Daniel stood there, the noise of the city fading behind him. Cars passed, people hurried by, the world kept spinning, but for a moment everything went still. He read the note again and again until the letters blurred. It wasn't closure, it wasn't goodbye, it was gratitude wrapped in heartbreak, proof that, at least for a little while, she'd felt seen. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. When he got back to the car, Emma was watching him from the window, her eyes searching. He smiled faintly and showed her the cardboard. "She left us a message," he said. Emma squinted at the words. "What's it say?" "It says she remembers," he said softly. "And she's trying." Emma nodded, her small hand reaching for his. As he drove away, Daniel looked once more in the rearview mirror at the cafe fading behind them. The bench was empty again. But somehow, it didn't feel lonely. It felt like the start of something still unfolding, quiet but alive, like hope learning to stand on its own 2 feet. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray, heavy day that already felt too full. Daniel was cleaning the break room when his cell buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it. Unknown number, local area code, probably a telemarketer or some survey, but something made him answer. "Mr. Rhodes?" a bright voice asked. "This is Megan Carlisle from Channel 8 News. I think you might know why I'm calling." He didn't. Not really. He rubbed at a coffee stain on the counter and said cautiously, "Can't say that I do." Megan laughed, the kind of practiced TV laugh that somehow still sounded genuine. "Your daughter's teacher sent me her essay, What I Want to Change About the World. She wrote about you and the woman you helped downtown. It's beautiful, Mr. Rhodes. We'd like to do a short piece on you both, a human interest segment." Daniel froze. The rag in his hand went still. "A piece like on television?" "Nothing intrusive," she assured him quickly. "Just a small story. People need good news these days, real good news." He almost said no right then. The idea of cameras in his apartment, of his name on a screen, of people talking about his life, it made his skin crawl. He wasn't anyone's story. He was just a man who had tried to do something decent. But that night, when he told Emma, her face lit up like sunrise. "Daddy, you have to do it," she said, eyes wide. "People need to see kindness isn't complicated. You always say that. I said that once, he muttered, embarrassed. But you meant it, she countered, grinning. If they see you, maybe they'll help people too. He tried to argue, but her conviction was bigger than his discomfort. So he agreed reluctantly, and 3 days later the TV crew arrived. 2 cameras, a lighting rig, a smiling woman in a blazer. They made the small apartment feel like a movie set. Emma loved every second. She offered them cookies, gave them a tour of her drawings, and introduced herself as assistant producer. Daniel, meanwhile, stood awkwardly by the window, tugging at the hem of his shirt. Megan, the reporter, was kind, genuinely kind, not the kind that came with cameras. She spoke softly, asked gentle questions. You didn't have to help her, she said at one point. Most people would have walked past. Daniel shrugged. I almost did. But you didn't. He met her eyes. Because my daughter asked me why I could. Megan smiled. You make it sound simple. It is, he said. That's the part everyone forgets. When they wrapped, Emma insisted on one last shot, the drawing on the fridge, the one with the 3 figures under the stars. She stood proudly beside it, smiling wide. That's us, she told the camera. That's our family. The segment aired the next evening. Daniel didn't even plan to watch it. He was making dinner when his phone started buzzing nonstop. Texts from coworkers, neighbors, even the landlord, who sent a single line that made him laugh. You clean up nice, Rhodes. When he finally sat down with Emma to watch, he expected it to be awkward. But as the screen filled with familiar images, the cafe corner, the worn bench, the soft narration about a janitor who changed a life, something in him loosened. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about a question from a little girl and a woman who just needed someone to remember she existed. The story spread faster than either of them expected. By morning, there were messages from strangers, people asking how they could help, where to donate. Food started arriving at the school, blankets, shoes, letters written in looping handwriting from people across the city. You made me believe again. Thank you for reminding me to see. I was Mara once. Daniel was overwhelmed. The front of their apartment looked like a miniature warehouse. He didn't know what to do with all of it, but Emma did. She spent the weekend sorting through boxes, stacking food, organizing clothes by size. We can give them to other people like her, she said, practical and determined. That night, as Daniel tucked her in, she asked quietly, Do you think Mara saw it? He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. If she didn't, someone who needs to will. Outside, the city glowed softly, and somewhere in the distance, rain began to fall again. Gentle, steady, cleansing. Daniel sat by the window long after Emma drifted off, staring at the boxes piled near the door. For the first time in a long time, he realized kindness had a sound. It wasn't applause or praise. It was the quiet rustle of people reaching out, unseen, unstoppable, like rain finding every corner of a forgotten street. 3 weeks had passed since the news segment aired, though, to Daniel, it felt like longer. Life had settled into a new kind of rhythm, quieter but fuller. The city had begun to treat him differently, though he hadn't asked for it. Strangers nodded at him on the street. A few left thank you notes taped to the building door. He even caught his supervisor watching him once, a strange mix of respect and disbelief in the man's eyes. But Daniel still took out the trash, still clocked in at the warehouse, still tucked Emma into bed every night. Only now, when she fell asleep, he stayed up a little longer, wondering where Mara was. Some nights he'd pass by the cafe after work, the same bench standing lonely under the streetlight. He'd slow the car just enough to glance over, hoping for a glimpse of her. Maybe that old jacket, maybe that flash of pale hair, but it was always empty. He told himself it was a good thing. No news meant she was okay. But that didn't stop the ache that came when hope and worry shared the same space in his chest. It was a Sunday when it happened. The sun was barely up, and the city felt washed clean by the night's rain. Daniel was at the stove making scrambled eggs when a knock came at the door. Light, quick, uncertain. Not the landlord, not a neighbor. He froze, spatula halfway to the pan. Emma looked up from the couch, cartoon paused mid-scene. "Daddy?" she asked. He nodded slowly, set the spatula down, and crossed to the door. When he opened it, he had to blink twice before he believed what he was seeing. Mara stood there. Not the Mara he'd met that cold night in the rain, not the woman wrapped in a blanket of fear and exhaustion, but someone new, someone transformed. Her hair was brushed, her face clean, her clothes simple, but fresh. A small backpack was slung over one shoulder, and her eyes shone, bright and steady. "Hey, stranger," she said, smiling softly. For a second, Daniel couldn't find his voice. He just stood there, taking her in like a miracle that had arrived quietly, without fanfare. "Mara," he breathed at last. "You? How are you?" She laughed, that same laugh that used to sound broken, but now carried warmth. "Better," she said. "A lot better." She took a small step inside, holding up a folded sheet of paper. "Got into the housing program. Claire, the social worker, she kept her promise. Small apartment, clean bed, real coffee maker. I start part-time next week at the community kitchen." Daniel grinned despite the lump forming in his throat. "That's incredible. You did it." She shook her head gently. "No, we did it." Then she looked past him, her gaze softening. And her. Emma had crept closer, peeking from behind the table. When Mara knelt down and opened her arms, Emma didn't hesitate. She ran forward and threw her small arms around her neck. Mara hugged her tight, eyes closing, her smile trembling at the edges. "Couldn't have done it without you, kiddo," she said. "You made me want to try again." Emma giggled against her shoulder. "You look happy," she said simply. "I am," Mara whispered. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." They all sat at the table after that, sharing the eggs Daniel had forgotten on the stove, laughing when the smoke alarm briefly protested. Mara told them about her new place. The cream-colored walls, the tiny window that caught morning light, the plant she'd bought that she was sure she'd already killed. "But it's mine," she said, and her voice trembled with pride. "Every corner of it feels like starting over." Daniel listened quietly, his chest warm. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was a continuation of their own. The room, once filled with worry, now held something gentler, healing. Before she left, Mara reached into her backpack and pulled out a small envelope. "I wanted you to have this," she said. Inside was a photo, taken by someone at the center, she explained. It was her standing in front of a pale yellow building, sunlight catching her hair. Behind her, in bold blue letters, a sign read, "Transitional Hope Housing Project." Daniel traced the edge of the photo with his thumb. "You look free," he said softly. Mara smiled. "I think I finally am." As she stood to leave, Emma ran to the window, waving until Mara disappeared around the corner. Daniel watched her go too, feeling the quiet settle over the room again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one hummed with peace. He turned to Emma, who was still smiling at the glass. "She's going to be okay, huh?" Emma nodded, her voice full of certainty. "She already is." Daniel looked down at the photo again, and for the first time in years, he believed in happy endings. Not the kind that came easily, but the kind that were fought for, one small act of kindness at a time. The idea came quietly, like most of the important ones do. After Mara left that evening, Daniel found himself sitting in the stillness of the apartment long after Emma had fallen asleep. The photo Mara had given him sat on the table, edges curled slightly, catching the warm light of the lamp. Her smile in that picture, it wasn't forced or polite or tired. It was alive. It was proof that one small act, one open door, could ripple outward into something real. He stared at the photo until his chest began to ache with that strange, restless feeling that had been haunting him for weeks, the feeling that just helping one person wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't guilt. It was purpose, rising slowly like dawn. He reached for a pad of paper from the drawer and a dull pencil that Emma used for her math homework. At the top, in uneven handwriting, he wrote 2 words, Project Second Step. He didn't know why that name came to him, only that it felt right. The first step was survival. The second was rebuilding. He sat there for nearly an hour, sketching ideas in the margins. Nothing fancy, just words and arrows, hopes disguised as plans. Hot meals, showers, fresh clothes, job board, counselors who listen first, talk second. He wasn't dreaming of some grand facility with shiny floors and slogans on the wall. He imagined a place that smelled like soup and coffee, where people could sit without being judged for looking tired, where silence wasn't suspicion but safety. By the time he put the pencil down, the clock on the microwave blinked 1:47 a.m. The page looked messy, crowded, but it made his pulse quicken. It wasn't just notes. It was a blueprint for compassion. The next morning, Emma found him still at the table, his head resting on his arm, a coffee ring half soaked into the corner of the paper. She patted over in her pajamas and read the words upside down. Project Second Step, she said slowly. What's that? Daniel rubbed his eyes and smiled at her sleepy curiosity. An idea, he said. A place where people like Mara can come if they need help. Not a shelter exactly, more like a home between homes. Somewhere they can eat, rest, talk to someone, somewhere they're seen. Emma's brow furrowed as she thought it over. Like a stoplight, she said finally. When you're not at red anymore, but not quite green. Daniel chuckled softly. Yeah, something like that. She climbed onto the chair beside him and studied the page seriously, like a business partner reviewing an important proposal. You need a better name, she said. Something warmer. She tapped her finger thoughtfully against the paper. How about Home for Everyone? He looked at her and felt his throat tighten. That's perfect, he whispered. Home for Everyone. Emma grinned, proud of herself. Can I draw the sign? Of course, he said. She grabbed her crayons and began sketching while he watched. A bright blue house with open doors, surrounded by stick figures of all colors, sizes, and smiles. Above it, she wrote in large, uneven letters, Home for Everyone. Come as you are. When she finished, she held it up to him. There, she said. Now it's real. Daniel laughed softly. Yeah, kiddo. I think it is. He taped her drawing beside the refrigerator, where Mara's old note still hung. You saw me. That's enough. For a moment, the 2 pieces of paper, the note and the drawing, looked like they belonged together, one the seed, the other the bloom. That afternoon, on his lunch break at the warehouse, Daniel showed the idea to Pete, his coworker who'd once joked about those people downtown. Pete read the page, scratched his head, and said, You really think folks would come? Daniel nodded. They already want to. They just need somewhere that feels safe. Pete hesitated, then said quietly, If you build it, I'll help. It wasn't a grand promise, but it was enough to make Daniel's chest swell with something close to hope. That night, as he tucked Emma into bed, she asked, Do you think Mara would come to visit our place? Daniel smiled. I think she'd help run it. Before turning off the light, he looked again at the papers taped to the fridge, the note that started it all, the drawing that made it whole. And in that dim kitchen, filled with warmth and the quiet hum of dreams taking root, Daniel knew he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something worth waking up for. The dream looked simple on paper, a community center, small but alive, a place with showers, warm meals, clean clothes, and people who didn't look at you like you were broken. But turning it into something real was another matter. Paper dreams meet paper walls, and Daniel learned quickly that compassion had to wrestle bureaucracy before it could breathe. It started with the permits. The clerk behind the city hall counter looked at him over her glasses, expression polite but detached. You're proposing a shelter? She asked. Not a shelter, Daniel said. A community space. A place where people can rest, wash, and find help if they want it. She nodded slowly, tapping her keyboard with the rhythm of someone already bracing to say no. Well, we'll still need zoning approval, safety inspections, sanitation clearance, and you'll need to prove consistent funding. Funding. That word became the anchor around his neck. He filled out forms until his handwriting blurred, mailed letters to businesses, churches, and charities. Most didn't reply. A few sent polite refusals, some quoting policies, others scripture. But every once in a while a stranger would walk into his life with a check folded into a handshake or a stack of canned food. Small miracles, he thought. He spent nights drafting emails and days on the warehouse floor. He skipped lunch breaks, picking up extra shifts to cover expenses the project didn't yet have. The landlord caught him hauling boxes of donated supplies up the stairs one evening and just shook his head. "You've lost it, Rhodes," he said. "You're cleaning floors by day and trying to save the world by night." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm not trying to save the world," he said. "Just a corner of it." Not everyone saw it that way. Some neighbors weren't thrilled about the idea of a center for the homeless on their block. They muttered about safety, property values, the kind of people it would attract. He overheard two men at the cafe saying, "It's always the do-gooders who make the biggest mess." He wanted to shout that kindness wasn't contagion, that ignoring suffering didn't make it disappear, it only moved it out of sight. But he'd learned that shouting rarely changed hearts. Showing did. So he kept showing up. He cleaned out an old church basement that had been empty for years, swept up the dust of forgotten sermons, and began transforming it with borrowed paint and donated lumber. Emma came with him on weekends, wearing one of his old T-shirts like a dress, her small hands gripping a paint roller half her size. She drew a sign on the door in chalk, "Home for everyone, coming soon." The volunteers trickled in. Pete from work brought leftover plywood. The barista from the cafe offered to organize meals. Even the landlord eventually donated a stack of chairs. It wasn't much, but it was movement. Still, the red tape tangled everything. One inspector delayed approval because of an outdated fire alarm. Another required an accessibility ramp Daniel couldn't yet afford to build. Every time he thought he was one step closer, another rule appeared. At night, exhaustion sat on his shoulders like a second body. He'd fall asleep at the kitchen table, plans and permit forms scattered like fallen leaves. Emma would cover him with a blanket before bed, whispering, "Don't give up, Daddy." Some called him crazy. "You're a janitor, not a social worker," one coworker told him. "Why kill yourself over this?" Daniel just smiled. "Because someone once asked me a question I couldn't answer. This is my answer." Others called him a saint, which made him uncomfortable. Saints were statues, untouchable, silent. He was neither. He was a man trying to do what should have been done all along, to remind people that dignity shouldn't depend on luck. One evening, as he stood alone in the half-finished space, he ran his hand along the freshly painted wall. The air still smelled of plaster and hope. He could already see it in his mind, the laughter, the conversations, the quiet moments of relief. A home between homes. He heard the door creak open and turned. Mara stood there, holding a small box. "Thought you could use some extra hands," she said. Daniel smiled, his fatigue cracking just enough to let gratitude through. "Always," he said. They worked side by side, silent but connected. When they finally stopped, the light outside had dimmed to gold. Mara looked around the room, her voice barely above a whisper. "You really think this will work?" Daniel nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It already is." Outside, the streetlights flickered on, catching the chalk sign Emma had drawn earlier. "Home for everyone." The words glowed faintly under the light, fragile but defiant, like the man who refused to stop believing in them. The night arrived with a breath of frost that glittered on the sidewalks, the kind of cold that made every exhale visible, proof of being alive. Daniel stood outside the old church building, watching his breath rise into the winter air. Fairy lights hung in gentle loops across the entrance, glowing gold against the brick. The sign above the door read, "Home for everyone in paint," that had already started to chip. But to him, it looked perfect. Not polished, not grand, just real. Inside, warmth spilled into the street. Laughter, the clink of dishes, the sound of conversation layered over soft music from a borrowed speaker. It smelled like soup and cinnamon rolls, like kindness disguised as dinner. People filled the space that used to echo with silence. Families who'd lost housing, veterans with tired eyes, mothers with children in tow, neighbors curious enough to stay and listen. Some sat at long tables sharing food. Others stood near the coffee urn, hands wrapped around paper cups, talking as if they'd known each other forever. Emma stood at the door in her red sweater and mismatched mittens, holding a piece of cardboard with "Welcome Home" written in her uneven handwriting. She smiled at everyone who entered, shy ones, quiet ones who hesitated before crossing the threshold. "There's soup over there," she'd say, pointing to the tables, "and hot chocolate, too." People smiled back, some even hugging her, and Daniel's chest swelled so full it almost hurt. He walked over and knelt beside her. "You did this," he whispered. She grinned, the kind that showed every ounce of pride and love a child could hold. "No, Daddy," she said. "We did." He looked around the room, at the way life had filled every corner, and realized she was right. They had built something that didn't just exist. It belonged. Mara was by the kitchen counter, ladling soup with the same care she used to hold a cup of coffee that first night he met her. She'd insisted on helping, wearing a blue apron that said, "Volunteer," across the front. When she caught Daniel's eye, she raised the ladle like a toast. He laughed softly, shaking his head. The transformation still amazed him, not just hers, but everyone's. The volunteers, the neighbors who had once doubted him, even Pete from the warehouse, who was now setting up chairs and trying not to look sentimental about it. A woman from the local paper was there too, camera slung around her neck. She asked Daniel if she could interview him, but he waved her off politely. "Just tell them it's open," he said. "That's all that matters." As the evening unfolded, the space pulsed with quiet joy. A man played an old piano someone had donated, his fingers clumsy but sincere. Children ran between tables, laughing, while volunteers served seconds to anyone who wanted them. There was no separation between guest and helper anymore, only people sharing space. Daniel drifted through it all, saying hello, shaking hands, refilling cups. Every thank you felt like an echo from a place deep inside him that used to be empty. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was trying to fix something broken. He felt like he was part of something whole. Later, when the crowd thinned and the laughter softened into murmurs, Daniel stepped outside to breathe in the night air. Snow had started to fall, soft and slow, each flake catching the light from the doorway. He looked back through the glass and saw Emma dancing near the piano, her mittens hanging from her coat pocket, her hair catching the glow of the fairy lights. Mara watched her with a smile, her expression gentle, almost maternal. Daniel felt the world settle in that moment, not in the sense of everything being solved, but in the way that something finally makes sense. He thought of the nights when he'd walked past Mara without looking, of Emma's small voice asking that impossible question, "Why is that lady sleeping outside?" That question had changed everything. The door opened behind him, and Mara stepped out, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "They're already asking when the next dinner is," she said. Daniel smiled. "Guess we'd better start planning." She nodded, looking back at the glowing room. "It's strange," she said softly. "I used to think home was a place. Now I think it's a moment. And this feels like one." He looked at her, then at Emma inside the doorway, still holding her sign. "It is," he said quietly. The snow kept falling, the lights kept glowing, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel realized they weren't chasing hope anymore. They were standing in the middle of it. Spring had begun to stretch its fingers through the city, softening edges, coaxing green from the gray. The air held that quiet hum that always came with renewal, the faint promise of something still unfolding. Daniel and Emma walked hand in hand down the same street they had 100 times before, the one lined with small shops and lamplight, the one that still carried echoes of a night that had changed everything. They'd just left the community center, where volunteers were cleaning up after another dinner shift. Home for everyone had become more than a name. It had become a heartbeat. The once empty church basement now pulsed with life and stories, with laughter that carried through the walls. But tonight wasn't about the noise or the people. Tonight was quiet, just father and daughter, side by side, heading home. When they reached the cafe corner, Daniel almost didn't notice at first. The spot looked different now, brighter. A new bench stood beneath the streetlight, its metal fresh and unscarred. Around it, someone had planted flowers, violets and tulips, their colors small but brave against the lingering chill. A small brass plaque was fastened to the side. He stepped closer and read the inscription, "For those still finding their way home." Emma stopped beside him, her gaze fixed on the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. "Daddy," she said softly, tugging his sleeve, "remember when I asked about the lady?" The memory came back to him all at once, the cold night, the cardboard blanket, the quiet question that had cracked open something sleeping inside him. He swallowed hard. "Yeah, baby," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Emma tilted her head, smiling in that small, knowing way children do when they understand more than they're given credit for. "I think she found her bed." For a moment Daniel couldn't speak. The air felt thick, heavy with meaning. He looked at the plaque again, then at the flowers, then up at the sky. The same stars that had watched over them that night blinked faintly above the city's glow. He wondered if Mara had stood here too, maybe to see what had replaced the cold concrete she once slept on. Maybe she had smiled, the way she did when something quiet but beautiful caught her by surprise. "She did," he whispered. "She really did." Emma slipped her small hand into his. "And you did too," she said simply, as though it were obvious. He looked down at her, heart tightening with gratitude. "What do you mean?" "You found your bed," she said, swinging his arm playfully. "You and me, and her, and everybody at the home, we all found our bed." Daniel smiled, blinking against the tears that came easier these days. "Yeah," he said, "so did we." They stood there for a while, the world quiet around them. The cafe door opened, releasing the scent of warm bread and coffee. Somewhere, a car horn honked faintly in the distance. Life went on, busy, imperfect, beautiful. But in that small corner of the city, under the same flickering light that had once revealed heartbreak, there was peace. As they began walking again, Emma skipped ahead, her laughter light and easy. Daniel followed, his steps slower, his thoughts lingering behind. He thought of Mara, of how far she'd come, of how one act of kindness had rippled outward into something he never could have planned. He thought of the people now gathering at the center each night, sharing meals, telling stories, building something that looked suspiciously like hope. It struck him then that life wasn't about fixing everything, it was about seeing, about not looking away. The rest unfolded from there. When they reached their building, Emma turned, her face glowing in the soft street light. "You think she ever comes back to visit?" Daniel smiled. "Maybe not here," he said, glancing toward the stars. "But she visits every time someone gets to rest without fear." Emma nodded solemnly, then reached up to kiss his cheek. "Good," she said, "because everyone should have a place to rest." He watched her run up the steps, her laughter echoing through the hallway, and when he looked up once more at the sky, he could almost hear Mara's voice again, soft, steady, grateful. He exhaled slowly, the air tasting faintly of spring and rain and memory. "So did we," he murmured again, more to himself this time. Then he smiled, turned off the porch light, and followed his daughter inside, the door closing gently behind him as the city breathed on. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to breathe it in. And remember, kindness doesn't need a stage, just a moment. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and what part of Daniel and Emma's journey spoke to you most. And if you believe the world could use more stories like this, quiet ones that remind us what it means to see each other, hit that subscribe button, share it forward, and keep choosing compassion. Until next time, stay kind, stay human, and never stop noticing.